All right, it is one after one. We'll go ahead and get started. We may still have some people joining us as we get going here, but we'll go ahead and get started. That way, we may wrap up just a little early, and you all can continue on your day. Again, welcome, welcome to today's webinar, Building Bridges. We're going to be focusing on ways to engage our communities in brownfield redevelopment assessments and some other visioning or other processes. And we'll dive into engagement a little bit deeper. But just to introduce myself, my name is Shane Barton. I'm the Downtown Revitalization Coordinator for the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. And over the last year and a half, we have been working in partnership with the Kentucky Department or the Kentucky Environmental Cabinet and specifically the Brownfield State Office. These webinar series as a part of the Brownfield Redevelopment webinar program here is all a part of that partnership. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, my name is Shane Barton. The easiest way to reach me if you'd like to follow up at any point is shane.barton@uky.edu. I'm pretty responsive to emails. But just a couple little housekeeping notes. We are recording today's webinar. And all attendees and folks who registered will be getting a link sent to them as soon as we get this uploaded. And I'll also be adding you to our newsletter list. So moving forward, if you're not currently receiving that, you'll begin receiving a monthly newsletter that we put out specifically focused on downtown revitalization and brownfield redevelopment. But let's go ahead and jump right in to some of today's conversation here. So for folks who have joined previous webinars, you've most likely seen this image. This is CEDIK's distilled version of kind of the redevelopment planning process. It's fairly simple. Obviously, it's a little more complicated, and I'll show you another sort of planning process to compare this to. But if you start at the top and kind of move your way down, you'll see that we start with community engagement. We really believe in establishing a team, a diverse team, to kind of move and build momentum moving forward. And with brownfield redevelopment, that usually begins with a building inventory or other sort of environmental site assessments, in addition to community planning, if a plan does not exist already, or community visioning. And then we move into evaluating those findings, looking for different types of investment or funding, and then putting that plan ultimately into action. But again, I just want to emphasize that we really do believe that this effort and this process starts with community engagement. And that's one of the reasons that we're talking about that topic today. It's kind of foundational to many planning processes, but also it really helps sort of provide greater insights as we move forward, thinking about how to solve some of these complex problems, but leaning and really utilizing not just the imagination and creativity, but the insights of local residents. Now, at CEDIK, part of our belief system is that engaged communities can create vibrant economies. And most certainly, we believe that as a part of these planning processes related to downtown revitalization or brownfield redevelopment. Just a moment ago, I mentioned that I would share a more complicated planning process. This is a very detailed process that is included in the EPA Revitalization Ready document. And I'll make sure to send a link to this when we follow up with all the attendees today. It really is an incredible guide. It has a really easy to use Excel spreadsheet, a series of worksheets or workbook that goes along with each of these steps that allows you to really dive in and document your progress as you sort of create your plan and get your community ready to tackle some of these brownfield opportunities. But you'll see all of these blue arrows really are opportunities for community engagement. And you'll hear me say this, but engagement isn't just a one-off event. It really is sort of a continuous cycle of not just keeping your community involved, but also seeking input and insights as you refine your plan, or start to really hone in on priorities or catalyst sites as a part of your redevelopment planning process. So for this process, it starts with kind of understanding the needs. And when we're thinking about understanding the needs, it's whose needs? The community's needs. So all of these sort of segments, creating project goals, doing that site inventory, really thinking about broader communication and engagement strategies, and then diving into those community needs are all excellent opportunities to engage your community. Uh, this process has an intermittent step that really focuses on environmental impacts and land use or infrastructure analysis, doing some market studies about those visions, and thinking about sort of financial or environmental opportunities and constraints. But as we evaluate that information, there presents another great opportunity for community engagement when we start to think about reuse visions and how the different visions that the community has align with what the opportunities are or the analysis that we just completed. And then as we move further down that process and we get into implementation, community engagement, again, is really critical as we implement projects, not just in communicating and keeping the community involved, but these processes take a long time to implement most often. And it is really important to keep that community conversation going around, what's taking place, keeping them updated. Sometimes it's really hard to see progress on some of these steps because nothing really on the landscape is changing. So it's critical to kind of keep that engagement and keep those conversations going. But, really what we're talking about here is a planning process, redevelopment or revitalization planning process. It's really an effort where we are shaping the future, and we're talking about how do we include people, all of the information we're collecting, all of those ideas, analyzing those ideas against what the current conditions are, creating some strategies, and then lastly, making a commitment to move forward. In most planning processes, we're going to explore all of our options. We're going to have to agree on some facts, create some new options, perhaps. Certainly, a critical piece here is developing the criteria for how we make our choices moving forward, and then making those decisions and agreements to kind of make some course direction. But, I always like to say that the opposite of planning is essentially just directionless drift, where you're just kind of working or meandering through an effort without a process or a plan to move forward. And there really are a number of benefits to planning and engaging people in these sorts of efforts. Oftentimes increased community engagement equals some ownership. And I'll show a great slide here in a moment that really illustrates what we're talking about here, moving from just simply being informed to ownership of efforts. We know that better data often helps us make better decisions. And so including community input and ground truthing the things that we think we may know about a community is critically important. And then hearing from the community also lets us focus on what matters to the residents or to those business owners or to the community at large or young people. Typically at the end of these processes, we're doing some resource road mapping, thinking about, okay, where do we find all of the funding for these opportunities? Who can get involved and what commitments can we make? And then lastly, there's this effort, sort of a longitudinal effort that is cyclical, where we are doing communications and outreach and keeping people informed about what is happening. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But when we're talking about community engagement and getting people involved, really what I'm going to be talking about today is some creative ways. And I want to remind folks that, engagement isn't a one-off. It is an extensive sort of cyclical thing that we do throughout a process, really throughout the life of a community planning process. And then that it really requires some coordination and collaboration across multiple levels and through different systems, whether we're talking about local government or county government, different sectors or industries within the economy, and the public at large. And really, that public at large could be all of your community members and all of those stakeholders. But, a couple little points sort of thinking about community engagement, and I'm going to start with the end first here, is that really we're trying to encourage future involvement and ownership of these ideas. I'd often share with communities that residents and other folks who participate in planning processes do tend to have a stronger sense of ownership in those ideas and plans when they know that they helped create them, or they can see their own voices in those products. But just a couple tips here, as we're thinking about engagement broadly, is, I'm going to encourage you to think about who is underrepresented, who isn't often invited to the table to share their ideas. Put yourself in those shoes. A best practice is often to listen more than you speak, because this is really about gathering input and gathering ideas. But it is also critical to address those barriers to participation. When you think about people, folks in your community who are underrepresented or don't often attend or can't attend, think about the barriers, whether we're talking about food or providing childcare. And I'm going to share a great story of an event that occurred where they really focused on this and had an amazing turnout. Be thoughtful about where you're holding the meeting or the timing, or multiple opportunities. Be creative. And I'm going to share really today is focused on different creative ways that we engage community that doesn't feel so formal. Because I know that formal spaces can often deter participation for some people. They just don't feel like they belong. Make sure to leverage all of those existing networks in your community, whether we're talking about organizations like the Chamber or the Main Street organization or tourism, the library, local school systems. Leverage those existing networks. But it's also important to acknowledge any sort of kind of historical events that created issues, or historical distrust in decision-making process. So manage those expectations about what the meeting's purpose is, what the outcome or what the deliverable is going to be, so that you don't set yourself up for failure. I often share my personal philosophy, which is to undercommit and overperform in these sort of planning processes or the commitments I make in community. I want to manage the expectations around what's going to happen. Sometimes it really requires you to set some rules of engagement, set those meeting parameters that reflect your core principles. And if something goes wrong or goes sideways, make sure you make it right. Address that in the moment. Don't let it linger in those meetings. And again, really what we're talking about here is getting folks involved, feeling a part of the process, taking some ownership, and encouraging future involvement as these processes and implementation, project implementation happens over oftentimes a long period of time. But when we look at the reasons why most folks don't show up, or reasons that are often cited for folks not attending or getting involved, sometimes folks just don't perceive they have enough knowledge to be in those spaces, or they had a bad negative experience at a previous type of engagement event. Sometimes there's sort of these historical patterns where decisions aren't really informed, or they don't take the input, or don't place a lot of value on community input. Again, set those expectations around what the purpose and goals of the meeting are, and how everything that's gathered is going to be used. A lot of times there's simply economic barriers where folks have to focus on basic needs for themselves or their families, whether they're working or whether it's dinner time. Some people fear that they're going to be judged in these formal spaces for making a statement that other people may not agree with. And again, setting those rules of engagement and your expectations for those meetings can help alleviate some of that. Sometimes, thinking about those specific needs or economic barriers, transportation barriers can also become an issue. In addition to childcare, what do you do with your child while you're at a meeting? I often encourage people to bring their children or work with partners who can provide activities for those kids. But then again, make sure you really do consider the meeting times or dates. Think about people's work schedules or religious holidays, meal times, or those other family needs. And another opportunity here, or another best practice per se, is have a couple different opportunities or meeting times. If you're having listening sessions or engagement sessions or visioning meetings, those sorts of things, set up multiple opportunities that touch on a couple of these different meeting times. But as we think about community engagement, I often like to address this because oftentimes when people talk about community engagement, really what I'm hearing them talk about is community outreach or education. The one way sort of short term, this is what we're doing. It feels more like a marketing strategy. It often sort of answers that question about, what can this organization do for you? One group tends to benefit more. It tends to be transactional, one way, directional, if you will. But I really want to emphasize the point that when we're talking about community engagement, today, really, we're talking about this long-term relationship building process, where we think about what can we accomplish together, both this organization or the community or this partnership and the community at large. We want the whole community to benefit together, that it is really an effort to connect people, not just to the planning process, but to each other and to their ideas, and that it is cyclical, that we will come back and sort of repeat or address and provide new opportunities for folks to get involved throughout the process. So again, there is a difference when we think about outreach and engagement, and the way that not just the organization or the lead person, if you will, acts within that, whether it's a short-term marketing sort of communication strategy or a long-term relationship building strategy. These are two examples that I like to share that really sort of highlight that, both from great sources, the CDC and this Healthy Communities Consortium from some time ago. But you can see here that really what we're talking about is sort of moving down a continuum, where we're informing, moving to consultation, involving people, actually collaborating, and then empowering ownership. I will share these slides with you, and these sources when I follow up with the recording. But this really does sort of give you a great sort of snapshot, if you will, about different ways to approach this, and thinking about how do we move along that continuum from just simply informing, that sort of short-term transactional one-way type of communication strategy, into actually involving, collaborating, and empowering folks. So, and this on the second slide here or the second image here to the right, we're really talking about moving in a similar direction, right? From informing, consulting, collaborating, and empowering. But lastly, the ultimate sort of goal here is empowerment and ownership, where community members really want to own the ideas and the projects, and they're committed to this long-term relationship with the planning entity or the municipality to ensure that idea sort of is implemented and maintained over time. There's a number of ways to approach this. We could spend an entire sort of webinar diving into each of these boxes. But again, I think these two images really are great examples of kind of best practices and the theory behind community engagement, and really illuminates the difference between what we're talking about in this sort of community-driven engagement and sort of outreach or engagement strategy that we often hear sort of in place of or defined as community engagement. So again, trying to move from informing and involving, collaborating, and empowering that long-term ownership of efforts is really what we're aiming to do. But who's going to be involved? Who's involved in these efforts? And when we think about brownfield redevelopment, we're talking about all the neighbors, the property owners, the potential buyers. Excuse me. Ooh, thought I had to sneeze. Sorry about that. All of the potential future investors. Obviously, there's lots of private sector folks at the table here, in addition to public sector, regulatory agencies, or those other sort of permitting parties, lots of nonprofits. But if you joined us at our last webinar about 2 weeks ago, and you can find that recording on our Brownfield Webinar Redevelopment Series webpage at CEDIK, and I'll make sure I'll share the webinar from 2 weeks ago with you on this one when I follow up. But we really spent the entire time talking about the downtown team and who those members traditionally have been as we work with communities, what roles they play or what interests they may have in getting involved. But you can see from this, when we look at our core teams, over a couple of years working with small communities, we often have that local municipal government, some of those organizations like the Chamber or the Main Street organization sort of representing local business interests. There's usually a tourism interest because more and more communities are seeing their downtown as the gateway to their tourism activities, or a place for tourists to sort of concentrate or get services or shop or eat. We tend to have a director or an executive director of a Main Street organization, or the downtown manager. And then there's a variety of issues-focused nonprofits, whether we're talking local philanthropic organizations or creative and arts institutions. But then, around that sort of periphery, we see those other sort of core members, whether we're talking about local extension agents, the farmers markets or restaurant owners, the local historical societies. The Trail Town program has been a great sort of organizing entity in the state of Kentucky. When available, we love to have local colleges or universities, local banks at the table, housing advocates in particular, as nearly every community is facing some sort of a housing crisis where there isn't enough stock for the number of people that would love to live there, or folks who are trying to grow or expand their families. But also, sort of as a secondary suggestion here, is there's a number of other stakeholders that should be at the table, whether we're talking about transportation and infrastructure, certainly engaging the youth, and I'll be plugging our April webinar where we're going to be specifically focusing on engaging youth. So I would invite you to attend that as well. There's economic development professionals often at the table, or those who manage or work with natural resources. Again, housing is a critical concern in most most communities. I would also invite you to consider, your educational institutions, or those focused on accessibility. We want to create places who are that are designed for all people in our community. And again, if there are specific special interests in your community, make sure they're at the table as well. But again, our last webinar focused on the downtown team, and we really dove pretty deep specifically into these team members, thinking about what interest or roles they play as a part of these teams. And I'd invite you to check that webinar out. We do have a couple wonderful resources that we pulled from our webinar 2 weeks ago, the Downtown Team series. It really provides a great introduction to the downtown team and provides those member details. But really, it's a great tool to support your communication and with those potential team members, because you get to think about and get a little insight into what motivates them, or what could motivate them to get involved in these sorts of efforts. But as we think about engagement broadly, and engaging those stakeholders and this community at large, really, what we want to do is we want to sort of stimulate and aggregate and bring together people who are the team, those champions that are going to be there and involved for the long haul. We want to drive a long-term vision, and ultimately we want to move ourselves towards community ownership. We want the resulting uses of these brownfield redevelopment processes to reflect the community's real needs. And oftentimes it's hard to learn those unless you specifically ask or engage community members or the community at large around what their specific needs are. But one of the things that it often does help us do is encourage involvement in the future, or encourage people to get involved sort of on a organizing team to move these places forward. Okay. But when we think about engagement, while this is a pretty big list, I would not say it's comprehensive. I've got some creative ways we can do engagement, and I've got kind of the traditional ways that we often approach it. I don't want to say one is better than the other. There are places for both, and oftentimes when we work with communities, we use a variety of methods. But when we think about sort of the traditional engagement processes that folks are more familiar with, we're talking about public presentations, one-way communication, maybe some Q&A, public meetings with public comment or listening sessions. Sometimes we hold public forums with a panel talking about different things. We may hold focus groups and really focus on and dive into the specific interest of particular types of stakeholder groups. Similarly, we may do key informant interviews, really to focus in and dive deep into topics where folks may have a particular specialty in or particular focus. We often will use kind of a very traditional SWOT analysis, or opportunities and constraints. A SWOT, if you're unfamiliar, is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We present it on a corridor, or on a quadrant, excuse me, and we start to fill in those and get a sense of what the community thinks in those four categories. Sometimes we'll do some trends analysis, thinking about where is the community headed. But also surveys are sort of a really traditional way lots of folks sort of engage or learn from their community. And then charrette's a really sort of intensive multi-day process that sort of combines a long-term planning process into a very specific event. But I want to share some creative engagement, and I'm going to be going into a couple of these as we get in a little bit deeper here in the webinar. But again, having family events, and again, thinking about those barriers to community engagement, having entertainment, providing food to replace that meal that they may be meeting. Think about what partners you can bring on, or underwriters or sponsors. And I'm going to share why that's important as I share a specific event that I think checks a lot of these boxes. I'm also going to be sharing what we call a radical walking tour. We love doing walking inventories or mapping exercises as a part, of these building inventories and capturing those property dynamics. There's great ways to incorporate storytelling or community stories into these sorts of opportunities, engagement opportunities. We love using photos or photo affinity exercises, and I'll share a couple examples, or at least one example there. Community photography is another great opportunity to engage community members. And we'll certainly be sharing a little bit, I think, about that in a youth engagement project that we'll be sharing on that April 17th webinar, but also having some pop-up temporary type events or installations or simulations, whether we're talking about tactical urbanism or using virtual reality, are great opportunities. And then Chalk and Talk is another program that we have a great toolkit on that I'm going to share a little bit about. But let's dive into some of these and talk specifics. And again, I want to share a couple of stories here about community engagement and the way different communities have really utilized them. So when we're thinking about brownfield redevelopment, one of the first things that we have to do is a building inventory, thinking about what buildings are out there, which ones may be abandoned, vacant, derelict, what have you. Then we begin to prioritize different types of assessments. But I want to share a specific story about a building inventory that was conducted in Harlan a couple years ago. They used a very simple technology. This is essentially a Google map that they downloaded and screenshot of downtown Harlan. And then as a team, they started to walk around and on this map, they put little green polygons, I believe in Word or in PowerPoint, on top of all of the buildings that were occupied or had active uses. Similarly, they did all of the ones that were abandoned in red. And begin to really look at sort of, okay, what's the contrast? Where are they concentrated? Where is sort of the visual that this community is struggling with abandoned properties? Where may we want to focus? But they also looked at buildings that maybe were government uses or in transitional uses to kind of take them out of the equation. What they found here really helped them in their community conversations. They realized that their vacancy rate was actually fairly low compared to what the community narrative was. And the narrative was that all the buildings are vacant, everything's boarded up. But what we really started to see was that a specific block was really facing substantial disinvestment and had for some time. And when you went down Main Street on your way to the courthouse, you'll see that big square just to the right of all of that red. As people went to the courthouse, they drove down a block that was entirely vacant. So it gave the lasting impression that that community was kind of vacant and abandoned. So it gave them really some direction setting around what buildings to focus on. And here's how they did that, sort of thinking about this continual cycle of engagement and what that process looks like, and engaging a variety of stakeholders. This is how they moved forward. The first thing they did is they drafted a letter to all of the building owners. Again, just a sort of an introduction and a communication. But what I love about what they did is they invited those building owners to be a part of the solution, to be a part of the future. And I've underlined this specific sentence. And I love this sentence. It has lingered with me for years. Speaking to these building owners about their property and some of the success that they've had, and wanting to invigorate downtown Harlan, they shared with the building owners that we can only do so through building partnerships with property owners like yourself, who hold the keys to our downtown future. I love that idea of engaging and empowering building owners who are sitting on these vacant properties to be empowered to be a part of the solution, or to be a part of that downtown future. They got a lot of response here, and were able to continually move that effort forward, because the ultimate goal here was to move from vacancy to occupancy. And they asked these building owners some questions. They gave them a little survey. Is there a business that you've considered, opening? And if so, how could we help you? Or what type of business is it? What's the biggest obstacle? Would they be interested in selling or leasing that property? Or if there was a renter or a buyer interested, could they make a connection? They had a number of building owners respond positively. And what they were able to do is to do kind of a market analysis to get a sense of what the rental averages were, what the square foot price were. So they become more informed, because if you're like most small communities that are experiencing vacancy, you may have some building owners who are sitting on vacant properties who really think that property is worth a lot more than what the market tells us it's worth, and they may sit on that until they know, or until they are convinced sometimes that property may not be worth as much as they think. Considering what the sort of comparables are in the community. Then Harlan, that team, they were able to work and move forward. What they did is they created the community story. What was the story of some of these historic buildings? What were the details? What were when we think about the building inventory, what were the details of these spaces? What would be marketable? They created an event about these buildings. They invited potential businesses or investors or buyers or renters, leasers, if you will, to come out and see these buildings. And again, they, in partnership with local realtors and real estate folks, and the Chamber of Commerce and local tourism, they created an event. They celebrated the opportunity to occupy what were these historic spaces that over time had really meant a lot in their community. Now, a few years after the fact, it is nearly impossible to find an available building in downtown Harlan. And I believe all of these spaces were transitioned or have current tenants in them. If you're interested in that webinar, we did a webinar specifically focused on that story, vacant buildings, what to do with them, featuring Colby Kirk, the then executive director of One Harlan County. That is available. You can watch that. There is the link, the YouTube link. But if you'd also like to scan that QR code, it'll take you directly to the YouTube video. But I will share this link as well when I follow up with the recording. Again, you can hear Colby sort of share the story of how they went through that entire process. It was pretty remarkable and fairly simple, but a great way to engage those building owners and the redevelopment opportunities that the other stakeholders and the other sort of planning team were really focused on. Another great example is a building inventory conducted in Manchester, Kentucky by a group of student interns. And what they really focused on was historic buildings that had been lost, and the types of uses. This was a great map. This is a little more complicated, right? As opposed to the Google map. But this was great to illustrate and help tell the story, because this community was worried about losing more historic buildings. So this map on the left really did provide them an opportunity to share stories around those historic buildings, but also look at the trend. And if that current trend continued, those historic spaces may not exist in the future. But they also documented sort of active and passive uses, and this became sort of part of the analysis for future planning and prioritization. Okay. But as we think about building inventories and specific building inventories for brownfield redevelopment, really make sure that you focus on the actual parcel, getting some details on it, who owns it, can you get access from the owner, describe that site, what type of building is on it, if there are buildings on that site, is there any kind of history to that site, what has been there, what is that building story, what's the tax situation or the property assessor, the PVA value. Are there any kind of known chemical or contamination releases? Has there been any kind of assessments in the past of phase 1 or phase 2, if you will, or has anything been cleaned up? And are there any existing redevelopment plans? Has that building been focused on or prioritized at any point in the past? And if so, what happened or what transpired or prevented that? I do want to acknowledge that I see a couple questions in the chat box here, and I'll sort of come back to those as we finish up the webinar. But one thing I wanted to also share an example from Manchester was a what we call a photo affinity exercise. This was after the sort of midway through that planning process, as we were starting to think about what the public spaces would look like. We really involved public design and sort of urban design here, and we asked folks to really share their affinity with their visual preference, what they liked, what they would like to see, what type of benches, what sort of public space, what types of gazebos, what sorts of crosswalks or public seating or planters. And this really was kind of a wonderful way for folks to share their insights or vote, if you will, to start to have conversations with that planning team, to be invited to stay engaged, but also to feel like they were heard. And we were able to summarize these photo affinities or preferences, not just provide them back and ground truth it with the broader community, but include it as a part of the analysis as some of those really detailed public design pieces start to come to life as a part of that plan. Another sort of toolkit that I want to direct your attention to, and I'm going to dive into a couple examples here, is from ruralplacemaking.com. This was created from a partnership between the USDA and CEDIK at the University of Kentucky, but there are a number of great opportunities shared on this website. They're all free. You can access how-to kits. But the one that I'm going to sort of direct our attention to first is our Chalk and Talk program. It's really a great creative community conversation starter. It's a series of chalkboards, three-sided chalkboard. We have a great two-page document that gives you a how-to guide, a detailed how-to guide on how to use it. We love setting this up at events and festivals, fairs. And oftentimes we use the prompt next time, and for this one it was in Manchester, so next time I come to Manchester, and we invite passerbys to share ideas. Throughout the day, they're writing ideas on the chalkboard. As it gets full, we take pictures, clean it off, make room for more comments. It's a great way for folks to share without committing to anything. They can share anonymously. No one knows who said what statement at the end of the day. And then for that community, we sort of transcribe and code all of those ideas, provide that back to the community as a little report, but also include that as a part of the planning process to help us sort of ground truth some of the other sort of visioning, but also to sort of think about priority setting. This is really a fun, creative way. It's a fairly cheap and inexpensive way, but we've had great success with this. In particular at festivals and community events, and getting people to share ideas that may not come to a formal public listening or visioning session. I'm going to share a couple other opportunities that are in that community and cultural assessments piece on the Rural Placemaking Toolkit. The first is the Business Retention and Expansion Program. Just a little plug. If you're wondering, how to learn more about how your local business community is doing, or how to get that local business community involved, I would recommend thinking about the BRE program, the Business Retention and Expansion. We do offer that as a community service. It is a fee-based program where we work with your local partners, really to have those kinds of conversations with your local business community. There's usually a survey or a series of interviews, and we create a report that really does answer the question, what's it like to do business here from a business owner's perspective? On the right, you see the first impressions. This is a great extension program that we offer at the University of Kentucky for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, but many other programs around the country offer this for their own states. It has been sort of tested over many, many years and is quite effective. You've probably heard or are familiar with secret shopper campaigns for stores. This is really kind of a secret shopper campaign for your community, where we work with volunteers to visit or plan a trip to your community, and they provide responses to an extensive survey about what their first impressions are. But the one that I really want to share is Where Your Sidewalk Begins. Again, this is a story from Harlan, where we just did that vacant building. This was another community engagement opportunity that they had. And really what they were interested in, they knew that they had some accessibility challenges with their sidewalks. What they couldn't really do was get folks to really fully comprehend the extensive condition or the sort of current condition and extensive needs that were there. Their sidewalks had some major historical challenges when they were first developed. And if you were in a wheelchair or trying to push a stroller through downtown, you really face some challenges. So what this team did is they brought together elected officials, nonprofit folks, organizational leaders, and they found everything they could with wheels, whether we're talking carts, AV carts, dollies, I think that a cooler on wheels, and they navigated their town, noting where they had challenges getting on the sidewalk or moving around downtown. And this really helped illuminate the need for some of those local elected officials to focus on seeking out money and investments or grant funding to address some of these challenges. So again, getting people on the street, having a shared experience, learning from each other, learning from experience and navigating the sidewalk was a great way for this community to learn more about the current challenges for their sidewalk and what that meant for pedestrians. Again, with a goal to create a place for all people, and not all people can navigate spaces the same way. So this was, again, a great way to kind of bring some of those accessibility challenges to the forefront. We often do walking tours. This is another great example called a radical walking tour. Again, you can find this there in the Rural Placemaking Toolkit, and I would invite you to do that. It includes essentially a workbook of sorts that walks you through this entire process, where we're capturing, what it's like to walk through an environment. What do those surroundings tell us? What do we see and what are we hearing, smelling, tasting, collecting information about the physical environment there. This guide includes lots of questions, activities, and a survey for your participants. And again, another great way to get people having a shared experience, but also sharing feedback around what their experience was as they were navigating your community on feet, right? Lastly, this actually, I don't know if this is lastly or not, but it feels, I know we're getting close to the end of the hour here. We've got about 15 minutes left. But this is one event that I really want to uplift because it checks a lot of boxes that we were talking about earlier. So this was an event held in the community of Wayland, Kentucky. This is a community with a population of around 400. They had 77 attendees show up to this event. And how did they do that? Well, they partnered with a local philanthropic organization, and they provided door prizes. They also, and what I mean by door prizes is they provided gift cards to attendees who shared feedback. And this gift card was essentially a token of appreciation to say, hey, we know you sacrificed time this evening. We know that there were probably other things you could be doing or may want to have been doing, but this is a token of our appreciation. Hopefully it can help cover your cost of attendance, whether we're talking about gas or perhaps a future meal. One of the ways that they really got this heavy attendance is they went door to door in their community. Now, again, it was small enough to be able to do that, but having volunteers go door to door and invite people personally really did prove beneficial here. They partnered with the local organization to provide kids activities. So they had a whole kids section where young people were entertained. They had lots of food. An organization donated a number of pizzas. They also did a potluck where people brought in food. So it was really a great evening of fellowship, of fun, of having community conversations, but they also had a band. So it became an entire community event. It felt like a community event with a little bit of this planning process embedded in it, right? You've got everybody there having fun, having fellowship at their tables, and volunteers sort of went around those tables, had conversations, documented those conversations, and then during the set break between the music, we also hosted a broader community session where we had folks engaging with stations around the gymnasium. This was held in a historic gym. And like I said, it really became a community event, if you will. So again, thinking about how you can overcome some of those limiting factors for participation, whether we're talking about providing food, entertainment, childcare, compensating people for transportation or travel or mileage or gas, really showing that you're making an investment in not just having that conversation, but really recognizing the commitment and the needs of the people who are attending that meeting. Again, really touches on a number of best practices when we're thinking about how can we bring the community together and not make it feel so formal or stuffy while we're being creative and having fun. Okay. Now, as we think about community engagement, just to wrap up here, you're probably engaged or engaging your community in ways to make your place better already. I don't want to suggest you're not. But what I do want to suggest is that it's not a this or that, but rather what we're talking about is an and that too. Don't limit yourself with your community engagement. Think about all of the different ways, that cyclical and sort of longitudinal way to keep people engaged and informed in your planning processes and contributing not just to the early input gathering, but also to the analysis and sort of final sort of priority revision effort. So, again, I always like to share here that, the ways we engage our communities are as diverse as the problems we're trying to solve and as complicated as all of the people who call our beloved places home. There are lots of ways to engage people, and again, they are as diverse as all of the problems we're trying to solve and the people who call our places home. I love that statement. But I want to pitch a couple upcoming opportunities to you before I jump into the Q&A. April 1st and April 2nd, we are hosting our second annual Brownfield Boot Camp in Georgetown, Kentucky at the Agricultural Extension Office. The address there at 1130 Cincinnati Road. Please, if you are interested, I would invite you to get registered. There is still plenty of time. This is a free event. We're going to be covering a lot of information over 2 days, really sort of talking about the basics of brownfield redevelopment, going through grant writing, thinking about resource leveraging and identifying other funding sources. And then we'll be spending about a half a day working through sort of talking about the actual brownfield, the EPA brownfield application process, and thinking about how do we respond to these questions in the most effective way to create a competitive application. Again, it is free of charge. You are invited to attend. I would certainly invite you to register. I would love to see you there. It's a beautiful space. And again, over 2 days, we're going to be sharing a lot of information. Additionally, I've referenced this a couple times today. we are going to be hosting a webinar on April 17th. That is a Wednesday. Again, we'll start it at 1 p.m., run to about 2 p.m. My colleague Mercedes, who really supports our youth engagement efforts at CEDIK, is going to be the presenter that day. But we're going to be focusing on including youth voices in downtown revitalization. And she's going to be sharing a couple great examples of ways that different communities have engaged their youth to get specifically involved. Every community I go to, one of the conversations that always comes up is this idea or this notion that our young people are leaving. We need to do something for our young people, but rarely do the people in those positions specifically ask the young people what they need or what they would like to see. So we're going to hold a webinar specifically focused on engaging youth because we know so many communities are interested in that topic specifically. So you can register for that. Again, if you receive the newsletter that went out today, you will see a registration link for this webinar in the newsletter, but I will also share the link when I share the video for this recording. Again, thank you all so much for your time today. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to jump into the Q&A. If you have any questions or any comments that you'd like to share, please use the Q&A feature. You should see that either at the top or at the bottom of your Zoom screen, depending on how you are accessing this recording. But I'm gonna jump in here and answer a couple questions. And see where we go. The first one is asking if Colby is still the head of One Harlan. I'm not sure. I know Colby had left that position and became the judge executive in Martin County. I think he recently transitioned. He may be at One Harlan, but I think he may also be at One East Kentucky, the organization that One Harlan was a part of. I'm not sure. And here, just a thank you for including some information about Harlan and Manchester, and sort of how those things came about from a local area development district. Thank you so much for being with us. We've got another question here. In your opinion, how has the community perception of brownfield redevelopment evolved over time? First, let me say I'm not a brownfield redevelopment expert in the sense of hasn't always been the thing that I have focused on. I have a background in environmental science, but have been a community planner for about the last 20 years or so. So while I'm not an expert in brownfield redevelopment, it has often been a conversation as a part of many of the communities that I've worked with. And this is sort of anecdotally what I would suggest how that perception has evolved over time. I think when I first started doing this work and the idea of brownfields started to emerge kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s, it really was saw as a one-off opportunity for communities to clean up a polluted site. Many times, those early polluted sites were some of the perceived to be more contaminated, perceived to be creating really community health concerns. And were prioritized in that manner, or they were prioritized because those properties were primed for redevelopment or sort of future investment. So I think early on there was kind of a negative perception around brownfield redevelopment, just the sense of communities having to accept the fact that they may have a contaminated property and what that may mean. I think anyone who works in brownfields knows that there's a lot of misconceptions around what it means to be working with the EPA and what that may mean in terms of a regulatory framework. There's often a perception that working with the Brownfield program is going to bring kind of the wrath of the EPA in terms of their regulatory telling you or dictating what you can do or what you can't do, or getting you in trouble or controlling sort of your future uses with that. Now, while they do provide lots of oversight in terms of how to mitigate specific contaminants, they're not necessarily a regulatory wing of the EPA. I think more people are becoming more familiar with that. But where I am seeing communities go now and really kind of where the EPA is also pushing folks who are working with communities to think more deeply about, is they really want us to think about brownfield redevelopment not as a one-off way to mitigate or clean up a site, but as a redevelopment tool, a broad redevelopment tool in your toolkit to help you achieve a longer, bigger community redevelopment or revitalization vision. In their grant applications, they are now asking about, what plan or planning process prioritize this. So that idea of a one-off, it really isn't competitive anymore. So they're kind of forcing applicants to think about, what planning process or community engagement strategies did you deploy to come to this priority? They really want to see how those brownfield sites or brownfield redevelopment opportunities are catalyst sites for other investments or other types of funding. They want to know how you're going to leverage or stack capital from other funders so that they are bigger projects than just a one-off cleanup of a site. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I have seen evolve over time. In addition to a strong focus on environmental justice or disadvantaged communities and the impact polluted sites often have or have had historically. But I think probably the biggest and anecdotally most general thing that I have seen evolve over time is this understanding that, it's not sort of a regulatory branch or regulatory effort, that really it's a redevelopment tool to help move communities forward. That while brownfield redevelopment is one of the goals, if you will, of a broad redevelopment plan, that it's not the only thing. That really it is part of a lot of other things. But because, for example, your EPA brownfield grant isn't going to pay for new sidewalks. It isn't going to pay for some of these things that are parts of bigger planning processes or community visions. So thank you so much for that question. I hope I answered it and gave you justice there. But I think, I can only speak anecdotally, but from my experience, that's really what I've seen. So thank you so much. We've got just a couple more minutes here. I'm going to give folks another moment or two. If you have another question, please feel free to share it, and we'll get it addressed here. But if not, again, I'm just going to give us another minute. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today and sticking with us through the whole webinar. Again, if you'd like to follow up, you can always reach me. The easiest way is via email at shane.barton@uky.edu. Again, if you attended or registered for this, I will be following up once the recording is available, and I'll share that YouTube link and some of the resources that we noted in today's webinar. Again, thank you all so very much. Not seeing any additional questions. So must have done a great job. Again, you all have a great day. Enjoy this first week of spring, and I will be getting the recording out to you really as soon as we can. So again, thank you so much for your time. Have a great rest of your week.